At some point, and for most people it happens so gradually that there is no single moment they can point to, you stopped being who you were and started being who you needed to be. The shift was not dramatic. It did not announce itself. It happened in the accumulated weight of small adjustments. The version of yourself you learned to present in the family system, the self that emerged through the specific pressures of school and friendship, and the first encounters with rejection, the identity that formed around what was rewarded and what was punished in the particular environments of your particular life. By the time you were old enough to ask, "Who am I?" the answer that came back was already largely a construction, a self that had been built not from the inside out, but from the outside in. Built to belong, built to be safe, built to be loved by the specific people whose love was available and whose conditions you learned to meet. Jung called this constructed self the persona, the mask, the social face, the carefully managed presentation that mediates between the individual and the world. But behind the persona, Jung identified something else, something he called the genuine self, the authentic core of who a person actually is beneath the adaptations, beneath the performances, beneath the accumulated layers of who they learned to be in order to navigate the specific conditions of their specific life. The distance between these two, between the self that was built to survive and the self that actually exists, is what Donald Winnicott, working in a different but parallel tradition, described as the gap between the false self and the true self. And the experience of that gap, the persistent, low-level, sometimes overwhelming sense that the person others see is not the person who is actually here, is one of the most common and most rarely honestly named experiences in human psychology. The counterintuitive truth that Jung's framework produces about the false self is this: the false self is not a mistake. It is not a pathology. It is a solution, a genuinely intelligent solution to a real problem. The child who built a self organized around being helpful was solving the real problem of a family system that rewarded helpfulness. The child who built a self organized around being invisible was solving the real problem of an environment where visibility was dangerous. The child who built a self organized around being exceptional was solving the real problem of a context in which ordinary was not enough to secure the love and attention they needed. The false self worked. That is the first thing to understand about it. And the second thing, the thing that makes the work of finding the genuine self both necessary and genuinely difficult, is that a solution that worked is very hard to give up, even when the problem it was solving no longer exists. This video is about the experience of living inside a self that is not entirely yours, and about what Jung understood regarding how the genuine self can be recovered, not as a dramatic revelation, but as a gradual, non-linear, deeply personal process of returning to what was always there. This is not a video about becoming a different person. It is a video about becoming, more fully and more honestly, the person you already are underneath everything that was built on top of them. The false self is not built in a single moment of trauma. It is built in the ordinary, unremarkable, repeated experiences of childhood, in which the child learns what is welcome and what is not, what produces warmth and what produces withdrawal, what secures connection and what threatens it. Every child is born with a genuine self, a set of authentic impulses, needs, feelings, and ways of engaging with the world that are simply their own, not yet shaped by the requirements of the social environment. And every child, as a matter of developmental necessity, encounters an environment that cannot receive the genuine self in its entirety. No environment can. Every family, every school, every peer group has its own unspoken requirements about which dimensions of the child are acceptable and which are not. The false self begins in the child's response to those requirements. Picture a specific child. He is 6 years old and genuinely naturally loud, full of energy, enthusiastic, physically present in ways that take up space. In a different family, this quality would be welcomed, channeled, celebrated. In his family, it consistently produces a specific response. A tightening in the room, a sharpening of the parent's voice, a withdrawal of warmth that the child learns to associate with his own natural intensity. He does not decide to become quieter. He simply begins to monitor himself, to notice when his natural self is producing the wrong response, and to make the adjustment before the consequence arrives. By the time he is 10, the monitoring is automatic. By the time he is 30, he genuinely believes that he is simply a quiet person. He has no memory of the child who was loud. That child went into the shadow, and the quiet self he built in its place became, as far as his conscious experience is concerned, who he actually is. Here is the counterintuitive turn about how the false self is built. And it is the turn that makes the work of recovering the genuine self so psychologically precise and so emotionally difficult. The false self is almost never built around qualities that are entirely absent. It is built around real qualities that were selected, amplified, and organized into a coherent identity at the expense of other real qualities that were suppressed. The quiet adult was genuinely capable of being quiet. The helpful adult genuinely has the capacity for care. The exceptional adult is genuinely capable of achievement. What was lost was not the whole self. It was the complexity, the fullness, the contradictions, and the dimensions that the false self's organizing logic could not include. The genuine self is not somewhere else entirely. It is here, underneath, compressed beneath the weight of the selection that made the false self coherent. The quiet man who no longer remembers the loud boy. The endlessly helpful woman who cannot recall what she wanted before wanting became secondary to being needed. The exceptional achiever who has no access to what they would do if no one were watching. These are not unusual cases. They are the ordinary result of a process that happens in every human life to some degree. What Jung described as the formation of the persona and the simultaneous formation of the shadow, the two always developing in tandem. The persona is the false self made socially functional, the edited version that the world receives. The shadow is the genuine self made unconscious, everything that had to be excluded to make the persona coherent. And the work of individuation is, at its most fundamental level, the work of recovering what went into the shadow without dismantling what the persona built. Not destruction of what was built, expansion of what is available to be genuinely oneself. The experience of living primarily from the false self has a specific phenomenology, a specific texture of inner life that is remarkably consistent across people who describe it, even when the content of their false selves is completely different. It is not primarily the experience of being unhappy. Many people whose lives are organized almost entirely around the false self are, by most external measures, quite successful and moderately satisfied. It is the experience of a particular kind of distance, from the life being lived, from the relationships being maintained, from the self that is doing the living and the maintaining. A sense that something is happening, but that you are not quite at the center of it. That the person others know is real but not complete. That there is a version of you that has never fully arrived. Picture this precisely. A person at a dinner party surrounded by people who like them, who find them interesting, warm, engaged. And this person, from inside the experience, is performing all of these things with genuine competence while simultaneously feeling, in a way they could not easily explain to anyone at the table, slightly absent from their own life. Not unhappy, not unfriendly, present in all the functional senses and somehow not quite there in the way that would make the presence feel real. They have learned so thoroughly to produce the version of themselves that this environment requires that they can do it without effort. And the effortlessness itself is the problem. Because what requires no effort also produces no aliveness. The false self runs on automatic. And automatic is the opposite of alive. The specific symptoms that living from the false self produces are worth naming precisely, because most people who experience them attribute them to other causes, to stress, to personality, to the simple difficulty of life, and do not recognize them as symptoms of the distance between the self being performed and the self that actually exists. The chronic low-level flatness that is not quite depression, but is not quite aliveness either. The difficulty of feeling genuinely moved by things that should move you. The relationships that feel real from the outside and slightly hollow from the inside, because the person in them is the false self, and the false self, however sophisticated, cannot be genuinely known or genuinely intimate. The persistent sense that the life being lived is correct but not quite right, that the right life is somehow just adjacent to this one, recognizable but not yet inhabited. There is also a specific exhaustion that the false self produces that is different from physical tiredness or work-related depletion. It is the exhaustion of continuous self-monitoring, of the background process that runs constantly, checking whether the self being presented is producing the right responses, making the micro-adjustments that keep the social performance calibrated, managing the gap between what is felt and what is expressed. This monitoring is invisible because it is so habitual, but it consumes energy continuously, energy that is not available for the aliveness that genuine self-expression produces, and whose absence is felt as a kind of baseline depletion that no amount of rest entirely resolves. The genuine self does not disappear entirely into the shadow. It cannot. The psyche is too committed to wholeness, to its own nature, to allow complete suppression of what is authentic indefinitely. What happens instead is that the genuine self finds moments, specific, often unexpected moments, to break through the surface of the false self's management and make its presence known. These moments are frequently experienced as disruptive, as embarrassing, as evidence of something having gone wrong, when they are actually evidence of something insisting on being right. They are the genuine self's persistent refusal to be permanently contained. The most common form of breakthrough is the disproportionate reaction, the moment when something small produces a response that is obviously too large for the immediate trigger, and that the person cannot explain even to themselves. The anger that arrives at the wrong time and in the wrong proportion. The grief that surfaces in response to something that should not produce grief. The longing that is activated by a piece of music or a stranger's expression, or a moment of beauty in an ordinary afternoon. A longing for something that cannot be named but is felt as the most real thing that has been felt in weeks. These are the genuine self, breaking through. The suppressed dimensions of the psyche finding the crack in the false self's management and pressing through it with the force of everything that has been compressed. There is a specific kind of recognition that accompanies the breakthrough of the genuine self, a feeling of finally that is immediately followed, in most people, by the effort to shut it back down. The person who, in an unguarded moment, says something completely honest and then watches the room's reaction and immediately moderates, explains, softens, takes it back. The person who, for one moment in a conversation, stops performing and simply speaks from wherever they actually are, and then, registering their own exposure, returns to the management. The finally is real. The shutdown is also real. And the cycle, the breakthrough and the immediate suppression, is one of the clearest indicators that the genuine self is present, and that the false self is working very hard to maintain its position. Jung would say that these breakthrough moments are not failures of the false self. They are communications from the genuine self, from the parts of the psyche that have been in the shadow and that are pressing for integration. Learning to receive them rather than suppress them, to treat the disproportionate reaction as information rather than as evidence of something having gone wrong, to stay with the suddenly surfaced longing rather than immediately converting it into something manageable, is the beginning of the work of returning to the genuine self, not the dramatic work of dismantling everything that was built. The quieter, slower, more sustainable work of learning to recognize the genuine self when it appears, and to give it, gradually, more room. One of the most significant costs of the false self is what it does to the possibility of genuine intimacy. Intimacy, real intimacy, the kind that produces the experience of being genuinely known by another person, requires two genuine selves in a room. It requires that the person being encountered is actually there, is actually offering something of who they really are, rather than of who they have learned to be. The false self can produce connection. It can produce relationships that are warm, functional, even long-lasting. What it cannot produce is the specific experience of being fully seen, because the self that is being seen is not fully real, and something in both parties knows it, even when neither can say so. The relational pattern that the false self most consistently produces is the experience of being liked but not known, of having many connections and feeling fundamentally alone in all of them, of being in relationships that are real in every functional sense, where care is exchanged, where time is shared, where warmth is genuine, and feeling from inside those relationships a persistent sense of invisibility that has nothing to do with whether the other person cares. The invisibility is not their failure. It is the structural consequence of being present as the false self, because the false self, however appealing, is not the person. And being liked as the false self, while the genuine self remains unknown and unmet, is one of the loneliest experiences available to a human being. Picture a marriage of 15 years in which both people are genuinely kind to each other, genuinely committed, genuinely invested in the relationship, and in which one or both of them has never been entirely themselves with the other. Where the version of themselves presented in the relationship is real but edited. The dimensions that seemed incompatible with what the partner needed or wanted or could handle, quietly excluded over the years, until the person in the relationship is a carefully maintained version of who they are rather than the whole of who they are. The marriage is not bad, the love is not false, but there is a specific loneliness in it that neither person knows how to name. Because naming it would require admitting that the self they have been in the relationship has always been a partial self. And that admission feels, from inside it, like a betrayal of everything that was built. The counterintuitive implication of this is that the recovery of the genuine self is not only a personal project, it is a relational one. Because the relationships that were built around the false self will need to be renegotiated as the genuine self begins to take up more space. Some of those relationships will expand to accommodate the fuller person. Some will not, because they were organized, on both sides, around the false self's particular version of who the person was. And the genuine self does not fit those terms. This is one of the real costs of the work. And it is also one of its real invitations to relationships that are built around who the person actually is, rather than around who they learned to be. The false self is not held in place by ignorance. Most people who live from a false self have some awareness, sometimes very clear awareness, that the person they present to the world is not the whole of who they are. The false self persists not because the person does not know it is there, but because leaving it is genuinely frightening in ways that the intellectual recognition of the false self does not resolve. The false self worked. It produced real results: belonging, approval, safety, love, in whatever forms those were available in the original environment. Dismantling what worked requires trusting that what replaces it will also work. And for someone whose genuine self was consistently not enough, or was received as too much, that trust is not easily available. The specific fear that holds the false self in place is not usually a fear that can be articulated clearly. It operates as a bodily certainty before it operates as a thought. Picture this precisely. A person is in a conversation where they have a genuine opinion that differs from everyone else's. Not a dramatic disagreement, just a real preference, a real perspective, something they actually think. And before they have consciously decided anything, something happens in the body. A slight tightening, a hesitation, the breath held for just a moment. The thought that follows, "I'll just go along with this," arrives after the body has already made the decision. This is the somatic conviction in action, the body that learned, in environments where the genuine self was not safely receivable, to protect before the mind has time to evaluate whether protection is still necessary. The conviction was formed by real experience. It is not irrational. It is outdated. The environment that formed it was then. The body does not automatically update its conclusions. It operates on the oldest information it has, which is the information that was most consequential. Here is the counterintuitive truth about why the false self is so hard to leave. The false self does not only protect from external rejection, it protects from internal encounter, from the encounter with everything in the genuine self that the person has not yet met. The genuine self is not only the warm, authentic, liberated version of who the person is, it is also the dimensions that went into the shadow because they were genuinely difficult. The anger, the neediness, the ambition that felt unseemly, the grief that has never been allowed to be what it was. Recovering the genuine self means recovering all of it, not just the appealing parts, but the parts that went into hiding because they were inconvenient, excessive, or incompatible with the false self's organizing logic. This is one of the most honest things that can be said about the work. It is not simply a journey toward something better. It is an encounter with everything that was real and could not be allowed to be. Jung would say that the resistance to leaving the false self is not weakness. It is the psyche's appropriate caution about a process that is genuinely consequential. The persona was built for reasons. The shadow was formed by necessity. The work of individuation, of moving toward the genuine self, asks the person to bear the anxiety of dismantling what worked in the faith that something more whole is available. That faith is not given, it is built gradually through the accumulation of small experiences of offering something genuine and discovering that the world did not end. Through the gradual expansion of the tolerance for being seen as who one actually is. Through the slow, non-linear, always incomplete process of learning to inhabit, more and more fully, the self that was always there. The return to the genuine self is not a single event. It is not a therapy session, a retreat, a relationship, or a crisis that suddenly delivers the person to who they really are. It is a direction, a gradual movement, sustained over time, in the direction of greater authenticity, greater honesty, greater willingness to offer what is actually there rather than what is expected or required. Jung described individuation as the process of a lifetime. Not because it is infinitely slow, but because it is genuinely ongoing. Because there is always more of the genuine self to recover. Always more of the shadow to integrate. Always a further reach toward wholeness that the work makes possible. The goal is not arrival. The goal is movement in the right direction, sustained. The first movement toward the genuine self is almost always internal rather than external. A shift in relationship with one's own experience before any change in how that experience is expressed outward. It begins in the moments of private honesty, the moments when, alone or in complete safety, the person allows themselves to acknowledge what they actually feel, what they actually want, what they actually think, before the management system converts it into something more acceptable. These moments are small. They are not dramatic. But they are the beginning of a relationship with the genuine self that is different from the relationship that has existed, one in which the genuine self is received rather than immediately edited. The second movement is the gradual, selective introduction of genuine self-expression into the relationships and contexts that can receive it. Here is what this looks like specifically. A person who has always performed cheerfulness in a friendship finally says, for the first time, that they are not doing well, and waits to see what happens. A person who has always agreed with their partner's aesthetic choices finally says that they actually prefer something different, and stays present with the small discomfort of having expressed a genuine preference. A person at work who has always presented competence says, to a trusted colleague, that they are genuinely uncertain about something, and discovers that the uncertainty is receivable. None of these are grand gestures. Each is a small experiment in offering something real and discovering whether the relationship can hold it. Each positive result expands, slightly, the territory available to the genuine self. The third movement, and the one Jung would consider most essential, is the ongoing integration of what is found in the shadow. Because the genuine self is not only the warm and appealing dimensions that were suppressed, it is also the difficult, excessive, uncomfortable dimensions that the false self could not include. Recovering the genuine self means recovering the anger that the helpful false self could never have, the ambition that the self-effacing false self could never admit, the vulnerability that the competent false self could never afford, the grief that the cheerful false self could never allow. Each of these recoveries is uncomfortable. Each of them returns energy that was being used to suppress what was real. Energy that becomes available in its returned form for the aliveness that the genuine self produces. The life lived from the genuine self is not easier than the life lived from the false self. It is more real, and it is precisely that reality, the specific quality of a life that is genuinely inhabited rather than carefully managed, that the next chapter is about. There is a specific quality to a life lived, even partially, from the genuine self. A quality that is difficult to describe to someone who has not experienced it, but that is immediately recognized by anyone who has. It is not happiness in the conventional sense, not the absence of difficulty or the presence of everything desired. It is something more like congruence, the experience of the self that is acting and the self that is observing being the same self, rather than the perpetual slight split of the false self's management. The experience of being in a conversation and actually being there, of doing work and feeling, genuinely, the relevance of the effort, of being in a relationship and feeling, without performance, the reality of the connection. These experiences are available to the genuine self in a way they are not available to the false self, not because the genuine self is better, but because it is real, and reality is the precondition for genuine experience. Jung described the goal of individuation not as perfection, but as wholeness, not the achievement of a flawless self, but the recovery of a complete one. The person who has done genuine work toward the genuine self does not become someone unrecognizable. They become someone more recognizably themselves. The qualities that were always there, but were organized into the false self's narrowed version, expand into fuller expression. The qualities that were in the shadow, the difficult ones, the excessive ones, the ones that did not fit the organized identity, return not as chaos, but as complexity. The person becomes, in the specific sense that Jung meant, more themselves, not a different self, the self that was always there, with more room to be what it is. What changes most visibly in the person moving toward the genuine self is not their personality or their external circumstances, but their relationship with their own experience. They become more permeable, more able to be genuinely moved by what is moving, more able to be genuinely present in what is happening, more able to be affected by their own life in the ways that make life feel like it is being lived rather than managed. This permeability is not vulnerability in the sense of fragility. It is vulnerability in the sense of openness. The openness that is only available to a self that is not spending its energy on containment, that is not using its aliveness to maintain a performance. The genuine self is not more fragile than the false self. It is more alive. If you recognized yourself somewhere in this video, if the description of the persistent slight distance from your own life, the relationships where you are liked but not quite known, the exhaustion of continuous self-monitoring, has the quality of something you have lived rather than simply observed, then you already know the most important thing. The genuine self is not gone. It is present, underneath everything that was built on top of it, in the disproportionate reactions and the suddenly surfaced longings and the moments when for just a second, you stopped performing and simply were. It has been there the whole time, waiting, with the patience that only something truly yours can have, for you to be ready to come home to it.